Bullies grabbed her clothes to mock. Her punch broke a tooth. The fluorescent lights of Jefferson High School flickered with an irregular rhythm that had become as familiar to Kira Delacroix as her own heartbeat. The harsh institutional lighting cast unforgiving shadows across the crowded hallway, creating a maze of brightness and darkness that seemed to mirror the social landscape she navigated daily. Each morning brought the same ritual of pressing herself against the row of dented metal lockers, their blue paint peeling like old skin, hoping to blend into the architectural bones of a building that had never quite felt like home. Her oversized thrift store sweater, a faded burgundy wool blend that had seen better decades, hung loose on her small frame like armor that didn't quite fit. The sleeves were rolled up 3 times to reveal her delicate wrists, and the hem fell almost to her knees, creating a silhouette that seemed to swallow her whole. Her worn Converse sneakers, once white but now a mottled grey from months of wear, squeaked against the scuffed linoleum with each careful step she took. The sound was barely audible above the morning cacophony, but to Kira, it felt like a beacon announcing her presence to anyone who cared to notice. She clutched her textbooks tighter to her chest, the familiar weight of knowledge becoming both shield and anchor in the turbulent sea of teenage humanity that flowed around her. The morning rush of students moved like a river around a stone, their voices creating a wall of sound composed of locker slams, sneaker squeaks, gossip, laughter, and the occasional shout from a teacher trying to maintain some semblance of order. In this chaos, Kira felt simultaneously invisible and exposed, a contradiction that had defined her existence for the past 3 months. Jefferson High School was a monument to suburban mediocrity, built in the 1980s with all the architectural charm of a minimum security prison. The hallways stretched for what felt like miles, lined with lockers that had been painted and repainted so many times that the metal underneath had become a geological record of decades past. Motivational posters peeled from bulletin boards, their messages about achievement and perseverance faded to ironic whispers. The smell of industrial disinfectant mixed with teenage body spray and the lingering aroma of whatever mystery meat the cafeteria was serving created an olfactory signature that Kira had come to associate with anxiety and isolation. Kira had been at Jefferson for exactly 3 months and 4 days now, ever since her family had packed their lives into a rented U-Haul truck and driven away from everything she had ever known. The move from the small bayou town of Thibodaux, Louisiana, to the sprawling suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia, had been necessitated by circumstances beyond her control. Her father, Jean-Baptiste Delacroix, had worked at the Valero oil refinery for 15 years, following in the footsteps of his father and grandfather before him. The refinery had been the heartbeat of their community, providing steady work and a sense of purpose that ran as deep as the cypress roots in the swampland. But the global economy cared nothing for tradition or family legacy. When oil prices plummeted and corporate restructuring became the euphemism for destroying lives, Jean-Baptiste found himself among the 237 workers who received pink slips on a Tuesday morning in August. Kira could still remember the sound of his work boots on the front porch that day, heavier than usual, carrying the weight of a man who had just watched his identity crumble into unemployment statistics. The transition from small-town bayou life to suburban Atlanta had been jarring in ways that Kira was still discovering. In Thibodaux, she had been part of a community where everyone knew everyone, where her great-grandmother's gumbo recipe was local legend, and where her family's Creole heritage was a source of pride rather than otherness. The pace of life moved with the rhythm of the tides and the seasons, and teenagers grew up understanding their place in a continuum that stretched back generations. Atlanta was different. Everything moved faster here. driven by an urgency that Kira couldn't quite understand. The suburbs where they now lived were filled with cookie-cutter houses and manicured lawns that looked like they had been ordered from a catalogue. Their new apartment was clean and modern, with central air conditioning and cable television, but it lacked the soul of the weathered Creole cottage where Kira had spent the first 15 years of her life. Jefferson High School represented the pinnacle of suburban educational achievement, at least according to the glossy brochures and the principal's welcome speech. With over 2,000 students, it was easily 5 times larger than Thibodeau High, where Kira's graduating class would have numbered exactly 43 students. Here, she was a statistical anomaly, a demographic footnote in a sea of faces that seemed to have known each other since kindergarten. Her soft Creole accent, with its musical cadences and French-influenced pronunciations, marked her as foreign in a place where Southern drawls were the linguistic norm. When she spoke, which she tried to do as little as possible, she could see the moment of confusion in people's eyes, the slight pause as they processed sounds that didn't quite fit their expectations. Her second-hand clothes, carefully selected from the Goodwill store on Buford Highway, told a story of economic necessity that clashed with the designer labels and name-brand sneakers that seemed to be the uniform of teenage acceptance. In a place like Jefferson High School, where social hierarchies were as rigid as any medieval court, being different was equivalent to painting a target on your back. Kira had learned this lesson within her first week, when a simple introduction in French class had marked her as an outsider worth noting, cataloguing, and ultimately exploiting. She kept her head down as she walked toward her first period biology class, her dark hair falling like a protective curtain around her face. The hair itself was another mark of her heritage, thick and lustrous with natural waves that caught the light in shades of mahogany and black. Her mother, Celeste, had taught her to braid it in complex patterns that were both practical and beautiful, but Kira had abandoned those elaborate styles in favor of simple, understated arrangements that wouldn't draw unwanted attention. What none of her classmates knew, what she had carefully hidden beneath layers of shyness and deliberate invisibility, was that beneath her quiet exterior lay 15 years of intensive training in combat disciplines that most people only knew from movies and television. Her grandfather, Auguste Papa Boudreau, had been her teacher, mentor, and the closest thing to a father figure she had known during her early childhood. Papa Boudreau was a man carved from Louisiana cypress and tempered by decades of hard living. He had served in Vietnam as a young man, where he had learned that violence was sometimes the only language that certain people understood. After the war, he had traveled extensively, studying martial arts in Israel, Brazil, and Southeast Asia, collecting techniques and philosophies like other men collected stamps. Krav Maga, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Muay Thai, and elements of traditional karate had been woven together into a personal fighting system that emphasized practicality over flash, effectiveness over artistry. When Kira turned 5 years old, Papa had begun teaching her the basics, not because he wanted her to be a fighter, but because he understood that the world could be a dangerous place for young women, and he wanted her to have options beyond flight or helplessness. The lessons had begun with simple flexibility exercises and basic stances disguised as games and play. As she grew older, the training became more sophisticated, incorporating techniques for escape, control, and, when absolutely necessary, decisive violence. "Violence is a tool, Cher," Papa would tell her during their sessions in the converted barn behind his house. "Like a hammer or a saw. It has its place, but it's not the first thing you reach for when you have a problem. You understand the difference between a nail and a screw, non? Same thing with people. Most problems can be solved with words, with patience, with understanding. But when someone means you harm, when they won't listen to reason, when they threaten the people you love, then you use the right tool for the job." The training had been comprehensive and demanding. 3 days a week, Papa would pick her up after school and drive her to his property, where they would spend 2 hours working on technique, conditioning, and what he called situational awareness. He taught her to read body language, to recognize the signs that preceded violence, to position herself advantageously in any room she entered. More importantly, he taught her to think strategically, to consider consequences, to understand that every action had ramifications that extended far beyond the immediate moment. Papa's lessons came with strict moral guidelines that were as important as any physical technique. Fighting was always a last resort, to be used only when all other options had been exhausted. The goal was never to cause unnecessary harm, but to end a threat as quickly and efficiently as possible. Most importantly, she was never to use her skills for aggression, revenge, or to assert dominance over others. The power to hurt people came with the responsibility to use that power wisely. "The moment you become the thing you hate, Cher," Papa would say, his weathered hands demonstrating a complex joint lock with surgical precision, "you've lost more than any fight could ever cost you. Your soul, that's worth more than your pride or your anger. You remember that." Those lessons had ended abruptly when Papa suffered a massive heart attack during Kira's 13th summer. She had been there when it happened, had watched helplessly as the strongest man she knew collapsed in the barn where he had taught her so much. The paramedics had arrived quickly, but Papa was gone before they could load him into the ambulance, leaving behind a 15-year-old girl who suddenly understood that all the fighting techniques in the world couldn't protect the people you loved from time and biology. Now, walking through the hallways of Jefferson High School, Kira carried Papa's teachings like a secret weapon she hoped never to use. The training was still there, muscle memory and reflex patterns that 2 years of inactivity hadn't erased. She could feel it in the way she automatically assessed potential escape routes, in how she unconsciously positioned herself to maintain distance from potential threats, in the constant awareness of her surroundings that had become as natural as breathing. But dealing with teenage cruelty didn't qualify as self-defense in Papa's moral framework. High school bullies weren't armed attackers or genuine threats to her physical safety. They were just children wielding words and social pressure like weapons, and Papa had never taught her how to defend against humiliation and ostracism. The first warning sign came as a familiar shadow fell across her path, breaking her concentration and sending a familiar spike of anxiety through her chest. Trevor Holloway stepped directly in front of her, his considerable bulk blocking her route to first-period biology, like a mountain that had decided to relocate itself across a hiking trail. The star linebacker had the kind of confident smirk that came from 16 years of never being told no, from parents who confused enabling with love, from coaches who prioritized winning over character development. Trevor was a physical specimen that would have been impressive if it wasn't attached to such an ugly personality. At 6'3" and 220 pounds of muscle, built through dedicated weight training and pharmaceutical enhancement that everyone pretended not to notice, he commanded attention through sheer presence. His Letterman jacket, forest green with gold trim, stretched tight across shoulders that looked like they had been designed by someone who built linebackers for a living. The jacket itself was a catalogue of achievements. Varsity letters in football and wrestling, patches commemorating conference championships, and pins that marked him as someone who mattered in the social ecosystem of Jefferson High School. His pale blue eyes held the cold calculation of someone who had learned early that size and social status could be weaponized against those who possessed neither. There was an intelligence there, but it was the cunning of a predator rather than the wisdom of a scholar. Trevor understood people well enough to identify their vulnerabilities, to know exactly which buttons to push to maximize emotional damage. In another life, with different guidance and better moral development, those same analytical skills might have made him a successful businessman or politician. Instead, they made him a very effective bully. Well, well, look what we have here, Trevor drawled, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. The words rolled out in the specific cadence of upper-middle-class Southern privilege, each syllable carefully crafted to convey both superiority and condescension. Swamp girls trying to sneak through without saying hello. That's not very neighborly now, is it? Behind him, his constant companions materialized from the crowd, like sharks responding to blood in the water. The comparison wasn't entirely metaphorical. There was something predatory in the way they moved, an eager anticipation that spoke to people who had discovered that cruelty could be entertaining if you convinced yourself that your targets deserved it. Madison Pierce emerged first. The head cheerleader, whose perfectly styled blonde hair seemed to defy both gravity and the humid Georgia climate. Her hair was a work of art, or perhaps engineering, arranged in cascading waves that caught the fluorescent lighting like spun gold. Every strand was in its designated place, held there by products that probably cost more than Kira's family spent on groceries in a week. Her makeup was equally flawless, applied with the precision of someone who had been perfecting the technique since middle school. Foundation created a porcelain smoothness that suggested she had never suffered the indignity of a blemish, while her eyes were outlined and shadowed to create an illusion of depth and mystery that was entirely surface level. Madison's smile was her most dangerous weapon, sharp enough to cut glass and wielded with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. She had perfected the art of looking friendly while saying cruel things, of maintaining an expression of innocent concern while delivering calculated insults. Her cheerleader's uniform, even when she wasn't officially representing the team, was always perfect. Pleated skirt falling at exactly the right length. Shirt fitted to display her figure without crossing the line into vulgarity. Shoes that were somehow always spotless, despite walking the same dirty hallways as everyone else. She crossed her arms and surveyed Kira with the disdain of an entomologist examining a particularly distasteful insect, her green eyes moving from Kira's second-hand sweater to her worn sneakers with the methodical precision of someone cataloging flaws for future reference. "Oh my God, Trevor, look at that sweater," Madison said, her voice pitched at exactly the right frequency to carry through the hallway without seeming like she was shouting. The tone was conversational, almost conspiratorial, as if she were sharing an observation with a close friend, rather than publicly humiliating another human being. "Did you fish that out of a donation bin? Because I'm pretty sure I saw my grandmother throw away something exactly like that last spring cleaning." The third member of their unholy trinity, Blake Morrison, snickered as he pulled out his phone with the practiced motion of someone who documented every moment of his life for social media consumption. Blake was the wannabe influencer of the group, someone who had convinced himself that his carefully curated online presence was a pathway to fame and fortune. His Instagram account boasted nearly 3,000 followers, mostly other teenagers from the Atlanta metro area who followed him for reasons that weren't entirely clear even to Blake himself. His carefully styled hair, maintained through weekly appointments at a salon that charged more for a single visit than most families spent on entertainment in a month, was arranged in the kind of deliberately casual style that took an hour to achieve each morning. His designer clothes, a Polo Ralph Lauren shirt, Vineyard Vines shorts, and shoes that cost more than some people made in a week, screamed of parents who bought him popularity by ensuring he never appeared financially disadvantaged compared to his peers. Blake wore his cruelty like a badge of honor, convinced that his ability to cleverly humiliate others was a form of social service. He had internalized the toxic idea that some people deserved to be targets, that being different or poor or shy was a character flaw that merited punishment. His phone was already angled for the perfect shot, ready to capture whatever humiliation was about to unfold for later distribution across social media platforms. Kira tried to step around them, a maneuver she had attempted countless times over the past 3 months with varying degrees of success. Sometimes, if she moved quickly enough and caught them at the right moment, she could slip past before they fully registered her presence. More often, her attempts at avoidance only seemed to amuse them, like a cat batting at a mouse that was trying to escape. This morning, Trevor shifted to block her path again, with the casual efficiency of someone who had been practicing this particular form of intimidation for years. His movement was smooth and deliberate, positioning himself so that any attempt to go around him would require her to either squeeze uncomfortably close or make an obvious detour that would draw even more attention. "Now that's not very friendly," he said, his voice taking on a mocking tone that carried just enough false hurt to make it clear he was performing for his audience. "We're just trying to welcome you to our school, show you some good old Southern hospitality. Isn't that right, Madison?" "Absolutely," Madison agreed, her smile widening in a way that somehow made it even more menacing. "I mean, we've been going to school together for months now, and we barely know anything about her. That's not normal, is it? Normal people try to make friends, try to fit in. Maybe she thinks she's too good for us." The hallway around them had begun to slow down as other students sensed the familiar ritual unfolding. This wasn't the first time Trevor, Madison, and Blake had cornered someone for their entertainment, and the student body had learned to recognize the signs. Some students actively gathered closer, drawn by the same morbid curiosity that made people slow down to stare at car accidents. Others tried to maintain their distance while still remaining close enough to witness whatever was about to happen. The crowd that formed wasn't large, maybe 15 or 20 students, but it was enough to transform a private humiliation into a public spectacle. Kira recognized some faces from her classes. Sarah from AP English, who always looked uncomfortable when this kind of thing happened but never said anything. Marcus from Chemistry, who seemed to take a voyeuristic pleasure in watching others suffer. Jennifer from her history class, who was already pulling out her phone to record whatever might happen. The formation of the crowd changed the dynamic entirely. What might have been a brief exchange between individuals became a performance with defined roles and expectations. Trevor, Madison, and Blake were the stars, the popular kids whose social status gave them the right to make judgments about others. Kira was the victim, the outsider whose suffering would serve as entertainment and a cautionary tale about the consequences of being different. The audience was there to witness, to validate the social hierarchy through their participation, and to spread word of what had happened to those who weren't present. Kira's voice was barely above a whisper when she finally spoke, the words emerging with the soft, musical cadence that marked her as different in this place, where differences were weapons to be used against you. "I just want to get to class." Her accent was more pronounced when she was nervous, the French influences in her speech pattern becoming more obvious under stress. The way she pronounced class carried echoes of generations of Creole speakers, a linguistic heritage that was beautiful and rich but utterly foreign to most of her classmates. In Louisiana, her accent had been unremarkable, just one variation among many in a region where French, Spanish, English, and African influences had blended into something unique and wonderful. Here it marked her as other, as someone who didn't belong. "What was that?" Trevor cupped his ear dramatically, his voice rising to ensure that everyone in the vicinity could hear. "Sorry, I don't speak Bayou. Could you try that again in English?" The laughter that followed his comment felt like needles against Kira's skin, each chuckle and giggle a small confirmation that she was alone in this place, that her pain was entertainment for people who had never learned empathy. The sound echoed off the metal lockers and tiled walls, creating an acoustic environment where her humiliation was amplified and reflected back at her from multiple angles. Some of the laughter was genuine, coming from students who actually found Trevor's comment funny. But much of it was performative. the kind of nervous social laughter that people produce when they're afraid of becoming the next target. Everyone in that hallway understood the unspoken rules. Laugh when the popular kids make jokes, even if they're cruel, because the alternative might be finding yourself in Kira's position. Kira's hands tightened on her books, and for a moment she felt the familiar surge of controlled aggression that her grandfather had taught her to recognize and channel. It started as a warm feeling in her chest, a gathering of energy that she could direct toward whatever action the situation required. Her breathing deepened automatically, her posture shifted almost imperceptibly, and her awareness expanded to include every person in her immediate vicinity. Papa's training had included extensive work on what he called the warrior's mindset, the psychological state that allowed someone to transition from victim to fighter in the space of a heartbeat. It wasn't anger exactly, though anger could be part of it. It was more like a crystalline clarity, a sudden understanding of options and consequences that cut through fear and confusion like a blade through silk. But even as she felt that familiar power gathering within her, Papa's voice echoed in her mind with the moral framework that had shaped 15 years of training. Violence was a last resort, to be used only when all other options had been exhausted. Fighting was for situations where someone's physical safety was genuinely threatened, not for responding to cruel words and social humiliation. The problem was that Papa had never faced the particular kind of psychological warfare that teenagers inflicted on each other. He had prepared her for armed attackers and genuine physical threats, but he hadn't anticipated the slow poison of daily humiliation, the way that constant cruelty could erode someone's sense of self-worth more effectively than any physical assault. She tried once more to move around them, but this time Madison stepped forward with the practiced timing of someone who had performed this dance many times before. The accidental collision was perfectly executed, hard enough to send Kira's books flying, but gentle enough to maintain plausible deniability. The impact wasn't particularly painful, but the psychological effect was devastating. Kira's books scattered across the floor with a sound like thunder, pages fluttering and covers skidding across the polished linoleum. Her biology textbook landed face down, with its pages splayed open. Her spiral notebook unwound itself like a paper snake, and her copy of To Kill a Mockingbird skidded to a stop near someone's feet. The sound of papers rustling mixed with the renewed laughter of their audience, creating a symphony of humiliation that seemed to go on forever. "Oops," Madison said, her voice dripping with false concern that was so obviously fake it was almost insulting to everyone's intelligence. "Sorry about that. Maybe you should watch where you're going. These hallways can be so crowded, and accidents happen when people don't pay attention to their surroundings." The comment was loaded with implications that everyone present understood perfectly. The fault was Kira's for being in the way, for existing in a space where she didn't belong, for having the audacity to think she could move through the hallways without paying tribute to her social superiors. The accident was actually a lesson, a reminder of her place in the hierarchy, and she should be grateful for the education. As Kira knelt to gather her scattered belongings, she caught sight of someone in her peripheral vision who made her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with anxiety or fear. Danny Chen stood by his locker about 20 feet away, his battered Nikon camera hanging around his neck like it always did, his expression troubled as he watched the scene unfolding. Danny was different from most of the students at Jefferson High School in ways that went beyond the obvious fact that he was one of the few Asian students in a predominantly white school. He possessed a quiet intensity that reminded Kira of her grandfather, a quality of stillness that suggested deep waters beneath a calm surface. His camera was his constant companion, but he used it to capture moments of genuine beauty and emotion rather than the performative cruelty that so many of his classmates seemed to specialize in. He was the quiet photographer for the school newspaper, someone who moved through the social landscape without really belonging to any particular group. He wasn't popular in the conventional sense, but he wasn't actively disliked either. He occupied a kind of neutral territory that allowed him to observe and document without becoming a target himself. Something about his gentle demeanor and genuine smile had caught Kira's attention from her very first day at Jefferson High School. Unlike most of her classmates, he had never laughed at her accent or made comments about her clothes. When their eyes met in the hallways or across a classroom, she saw something there that might have been understanding, maybe even recognition of a kindred spirit. Their eyes met now for just a moment across the corridor, and she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. There was concern there, yes, but also something that looked like anger on her behalf. His hands were clenched around his camera strap, and she could see the tension in his shoulders as he watched Trevor and his friends humiliate her. For a moment, she thought he might intervene, might cross the distance between them and say something that would change the dynamic of the situation. But before either of them could act, the warning bell rang with its harsh electronic shriek, signaling that students had 5 minutes to reach their first period classes. The sound seemed to break whatever spell had held the crowd together. Students began to disperse reluctantly, some casting backward glances to see if anything else interesting might happen, others hurrying toward their classrooms with the relieved efficiency of people escaping an uncomfortable situation. "Better hurry up, swamp girl," Trevor called over his shoulder as he walked away, his voice carrying easily over the noise of students changing classes. "Wouldn't want to be late on top of everything else. Though I suppose being on time won't help much when you're already behind in every other way that matters." Madison's laughter trailed behind them like perfume, sweet and poisonous in equal measure. "Maybe she'll learn to speak properly by graduation," she added, "though I wouldn't bet money on it." Blake was still recording, his phone capturing Kira's humiliation for later distribution across whatever social media platforms he deemed worthy of his content. The video would probably be online within the hour, tagged with hashtags that would ensure maximum visibility among their peer group. Jefferson High, swamp girl, awkward fail, so sad. As Kira finished gathering her scattered books and papers, she felt the familiar weight of isolation settling over her like a blanket soaked in cold water. The hallway was emptying quickly now, students hurrying to beat the final bell, and soon she would be alone with her humiliation and the echo of laughter that seemed to linger in the air like smoke. But as she stood up, clutching her rescued belongings to her chest, she realized that Danny was still there. He had approached during the chaos of gathering her things, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that timing mattered in these situations. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying a warmth that was in stark contrast to the cruelty she had just experienced. The simple question, asked with such genuine concern, almost broke her composure entirely. She had grown so accustomed to being treated as less than human that basic kindness felt like a foreign language. She nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she tried to speak. "They're assholes," Danny said, and the unexpected vulgarity from someone so generally mild-mannered almost made her smile despite everything. "Don't let them make you think there's anything wrong with you. There isn't." The final bell rang before she could respond, and they both hurried toward their respective classrooms, but his words followed her through the day like a small flame in a very dark place. The next few weeks established a pattern that made Kira's stomach clench every morning when she woke up, her body anticipating the daily dose of psychological poison before her mind was even fully conscious. Trevor, Madison, and Blake seemed to have an uncanny ability to find her wherever she went, as if they had installed some kind of tracking system that allowed them to locate her whenever she thought she had found a safe space. The cafeteria became a particular battleground, a vast space filled with round tables that created natural territories for different social groups. The popular kids claimed the tables near the windows, where natural light enhanced their carefully maintained appearances, and their laughter could be heard across the entire room. The athletes had their section near the food service area, their conversations dominated by upcoming games and recruiting visits. The theater kids clustered near the stage, their discussions animated by whatever production they were currently rehearsing. Kira had found refuge at a small table in the far corner near the emergency exit and the garbage bins. It wasn't prime real estate by any measure, but it offered clear sight lines to most of the room and quick access to escape routes if the situation required it. Papa's training had included extensive work on tactical positioning, and even in a high school cafeteria, those lessons proved valuable. She had been eating lunch alone for weeks, working her way through homemade meals that her mother packed with the kind of care that spoke to both love and economic necessity. Celeste Delacroix was a gifted cook who could transform inexpensive ingredients into meals that would have impressed restaurant critics. But her creations looked strange and foreign compared to the processed foods that most of her classmates consumed. Today's lunch was a perfect example. Jambalaya made with leftover chicken, andouille sausage, and vegetables that were approaching their expiration date. The dish was aromatic and flavorful, seasoned with a complex blend of spices that Celeste had learned from her own grandmother. But to teenagers accustomed to hamburgers and pizza, it looked exotic and vaguely suspicious. Trevor, Madison, and Blake had developed a routine of walking past her table during their lunch period, timing their movements to coincide with her meal. They would slow down as they approached, their voices rising just enough to ensure she could hear every word. "Jesus, what is that smell?" Madison would ask, her nose wrinkling in exaggerated disgust. "It's like someone took a garbage disposal and mixed it with, I don't even know what." "Swamp food," Trevor would reply with authoritative certainty. "They probably eat roadkill down there. Possums and alligators and whatever else they can scrape off the highway." Blake would document these exchanges with his phone, capturing Kira's reactions for later entertainment. The videos never showed what preceded her expressions of hurt and anger, just her face responding to comments that were edited out of the final product. To anyone watching without context, she would appear to be randomly upset or aggressive, further cementing her reputation as weird and unstable. The library had become another hunting ground, despite being supposedly neutral territory supervised by Mrs. Henderson, an elderly librarian who was more interested in her romance novels than maintaining order among the students. Kira would find refuge among the stacks, losing herself in books that transported her away from the daily reality of Jefferson High School. But even there, they would find her. Trevor would walk past her table and accidentally brush against her chair, sending her sprawling. Madison would whisper comments about her outdated phone and worn backpack, her voice carrying just far enough to be heard, but not so far as to attract the librarian's attention. Blake would position himself to capture her discomfort, building a portfolio of content that painted her as a pathetic figure worthy of mockery. "Look at that phone," Madison would whisper to Blake, her voice pitched at exactly the right frequency to carry to Kira's ears without reaching Mrs. Henderson's desk. "I think my little brother had one like that in middle school. Does it even have internet access?" "Probably uses dial-up at home," Blake would respond, both of them laughing at a reference to technology that predated their own births, but served their purpose of making Kira feel outdated and poor. The worst incidents happened in the less supervised areas of the school, places where teachers rarely ventured and security cameras had blind spots. The stairwell between the second and third floors became a particular danger zone, a concrete and steel canyon where sounds echoed strangely and help seemed very far away. It was there that Trevor would accidentally shoulder-check her into the wall, his considerable mass sending her ricocheting off concrete blocks with enough force to leave bruises that she would have to explain to her parents. The impacts were calculated to cause pain without leaving obvious injury. Amateur techniques that achieved maximum psychological effect while maintaining plausible deniability. "Watch where you're going, swamp girl," he would say after each collision, his voice loud enough to be heard by any witnesses, but innocent enough to deflect blame. "These stairs can be dangerous if you don't pay attention." Madison would follow up with comments about Kira's clumsiness, suggesting that maybe she was too stupid to navigate a simple staircase. The implication was always the same. The fault was Kira's for existing in their space, for failing to recognize her subordinate position in the social hierarchy, for having the audacity to think she deserved to move through the school without paying tribute to her betters. The psychological warfare was sophisticated and relentless. They had identified her vulnerabilities with the precision of trained interrogators. Her accent, her clothes, her family's economic situation, her social isolation. Each attack was carefully calibrated to cause maximum emotional damage while remaining within the boundaries of behavior that adults would dismiss as kids being kids. But it was in the courtyard behind the gymnasium where things finally escalated beyond the realm of mere psychological cruelty into something that would change everything. The courtyard was a forgotten corner of the school grounds, a concrete plaza surrounded by aging pine trees that had been landscaped decades ago and then largely abandoned. A few picnic tables were scattered across the space, their metal surfaces scarred by years of graffiti and weather damage. Kira had discovered the courtyard during her second week at Jefferson High School, recognizing it as one of the few places where she could eat lunch without being constantly observed and judged. The space was technically part of the school grounds, but it was far enough from the main building that most students never bothered to venture there. It offered privacy, quiet, and most importantly, escape routes in multiple directions if the situation required it. She had been eating lunch alone at one of the more secluded picnic tables, trying to lose herself in a worn paperback copy of The Count of Monte Cristo that she had borrowed from the public library. The book was an escape, a doorway into a world where justice eventually prevailed and the innocent were vindicated after enduring terrible suffering. She had been reading the same passage for the third time, her concentration scattered by the anxiety that had become her constant companion when the familiar shadow fell across her page. "Reading alone again, I see," Trevor said, settling onto the bench across from her without invitation. His movement was casual and confident, the body language of someone who had never questioned his right to occupy any space he chose. "You know, most people eat lunch with friends, but I guess that would require having friends first." Madison and Blake flanked him like courtiers attending a king, their expressions promising entertainment at Kira's expense. Madison had apparently decided that the courtyard's relative privacy made it safe to escalate beyond their usual level of cruelty, while Blake was already positioning his phone for optimal recording angles. "You know, I've been thinking," Madison said, examining her perfectly manicured nails with the kind of attention usually reserved for works of art. Each nail was painted in a different shade of pink, creating a gradient effect that had probably taken hours to achieve and cost more than Kira's family spent on groceries in a week. "There has to be a reason why you're so antisocial. I mean, normal people try to make friends when they move to a new place. They make an effort to fit in. Maybe she thinks she's too good for us," Blake suggested, his voice taking on the tone of someone making a profound observation. His phone was already recording, capturing angles that would make whatever happened next look as humiliating as possible. You know how some people get when they move from a worse place to a better place. They think they're special because they escaped whatever hellhole they came from. Kira closed her book slowly, her fingers tracing the worn cover with its faded illustration of a man in a prison cell. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was reading about unjust imprisonment while feeling trapped in her own circumstances. "I'm not bothering anyone. I just want to eat lunch and read my book." "See? There's that attitude again," Trevor said, his voice hardening in a way that suggested the conversation was about to take a darker turn. "You come to our school, you eat our food, you breathe our air, you use our facilities, and you can't even be bothered to be social. That's not just rude, it's ungrateful." The accusation hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that everyone present understood perfectly. Trevor was establishing ownership. This was his school, his territory, his domain, and Kira was trespassing without paying proper tribute. The suggestion that she was consuming resources that belonged to others was particularly vicious, playing on economic anxieties that cut deeper than simple social rejection. Madison leaned forward, her smile taking on a predatory quality that reminded Kira uncomfortably of the alligators that had lived in the bayou behind her grandfather's house. "Maybe we should help her with her social skills. Give her some pointers on how to fit in around here." "That's actually a really good idea," Blake agreed, his voice rising with the enthusiasm of someone who sensed an opportunity for particularly entertaining content. "Like a makeover show, but for personality instead of clothes. Though honestly, she could use help with both." The confrontation might have ended there, as it usually did, with Kira packing up her things and finding somewhere else to go. She had become expert at strategic retreat, at recognizing when a situation was escalating beyond her ability to manage it through passive resistance. Papa's training had included extensive work on tactical withdrawal, on understanding that sometimes the wisest course of action was to avoid a fight entirely. But then Danny appeared at the edge of the courtyard, and everything changed. He walked toward them with purpose, his camera bag slung over his shoulder and his expression troubled in a way that suggested he had been looking for her specifically. His timing couldn't have been accidental. He must have noticed her absence from the main lunch areas and come searching, driven by some combination of concern and instinct that told him she might be in trouble. "Hey, Kira!" he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the space between them. "I was looking for you. Mrs. Peterson wanted to know if you'd be interested in helping with the literary magazine. She said your essay about Louisiana was really good, and she thinks you might have some valuable perspectives to contribute." The simple act of someone acknowledging her existence, let alone praising her work, sent a warm flutter through Kira's chest that was entirely different from the cold anxiety she had grown accustomed to. Danny's smile was genuine, untainted by the performative cruelty that characterized so many interactions at Jefferson High School. For a moment, she forgot about the three predators sitting across from her and allowed herself to feel something approaching hope. Mrs. Peterson was her AP English teacher, a woman in her 50s who had somehow managed to maintain her idealism despite decades of working in public education. She treated her students as individuals rather than statistics, and she had been one of the few adults at Jefferson High School who seemed to recognize that Kira had something valuable to offer beyond her status as an outsider. "I'd like that," Kira said, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. The prospect of working on the literary magazine, of having her writing valued and respected, felt like a lifeline thrown to someone who had been drowning in isolation. But Trevor's expression had darkened at the interruption, his features shifting from cruel amusement to genuine anger. He wasn't accustomed to having his entertainment interrupted, and Danny's arrival had disrupted the carefully orchestrated dynamic that allowed him to maintain control over the situation. "Well, well," Trevor said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge that hadn't been there before. "Looks like Swamp Girl found herself a boyfriend. How romantic." "Danny, right?" Madison's voice took on a sickeningly sweet tone that was somehow more menacing than outright hostility. Her smile widened, but it was the kind of expression that sharks might make if they were capable of facial expressions. You probably don't realize this, but you're talking to the school's charity case. We were just trying to help her understand how things work around here. Danny's jaw tightened, and Kira saw his hands clench around his camera strap with enough force to turn his knuckles white. Looks to me like you're just being cruel for no reason. Maybe you should find something better to do with your time. Cruel. Trevor stood up slowly, using his considerable height advantage to loom over the smaller boy. At 6'3", he towered over Danny's more modest 5'8" frame, and he used every inch of that difference to create an atmosphere of physical intimidation. We're being educational. Someone needs to teach both of you about respect and social hierarchy. The confrontation escalated with the kind of inevitable momentum that Kira recognized from her grandfather's stories about bar fights and street violence. There was a point in any conflict where words stopped being sufficient, where the underlying tensions and power dynamics demanded resolution through more primitive means. She could see that point approaching like a storm front on the horizon, dark and unavoidable. Blake continued recording throughout the escalation, his phone capturing every moment with the dedication of someone who understood that this footage would be social media gold. The video would probably go viral within the school's social networks, cementing reputations and social positions in ways that would last for the remainder of their high school careers. Trevor stepped closer to Danny, using his size to create an atmosphere of threat that was unmistakable. You know what your problem is, picture boy. You don't understand your place. You think you can just waltz over here and interrupt us when we're having a conversation. That shows a serious lack of respect. Madison stood up as well, her heels clicking against the concrete with sharp, staccato sounds that somehow made the courtyard feel even more isolated. Maybe you should stick to taking pictures of things that can't fight back. You know, flowers and buildings and other inanimate objects. Leave him alone, Kira said, her voice cutting through the tension with an authority that surprised even her. She had stood up without realizing it, her body automatically shifting into a position that Papa would have recognized as a combat stance. He didn't do anything wrong. Trevor turned to her with a laugh that held no humor whatsoever. Oh, now you want to play protector? That's rich. The little swamp rat thinks she can stand up for her boyfriend. I said leave him alone. Kira's voice carried a new quality now, something that made Madison take a half step backward without realizing it. There was steel in her tone, a core of strength that hadn't been there during their previous encounters. Or what? Trevor spread his arms wide, playing to his audience of one recording phone and whatever invisible crowd he imagined was watching. What are you going to do about it, swamp girl? You gonna call your daddy? Oh wait, that's right, he doesn't have a job anymore, does he? The comment hit Kira like a physical blow, cutting through her anger and striking directly at one of her deepest vulnerabilities. The fact that Trevor knew about her father's unemployment meant that he had been gathering intelligence about her family, researching her background for the specific purpose of causing maximum emotional damage. But it was what happened next that crossed the line from psychological warfare into physical confrontation. Trevor reached for Danny's camera, his intention clear in the predatory smile that spread across his face. He was going to take it, probably break it, certainly humiliate Danny in front of Blake's recording phone. The camera represented more than just equipment. It was Danny's identity, his art, his way of seeing and interpreting the world. Nice camera, Trevor said, his hand closing around the strap. Bet it cost a lot of money. Be a real shame if something happened to it. What happened next moved with the fluid inevitability of a dance that Kira had practiced 1,000 times but never performed for an audience. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her mind as she stepped forward, her body shifting into the familiar stance that had become second nature through years of repetition. "Violence is never the first choice, Cher," Papa's voice seemed to whisper in her ear, "but sometimes it's the only choice that matters." Trevor's hand was inches from Danny's camera when Kira's palm strike caught him in the solar plexus with surgical precision. The impact drove the air from his lungs and sent him stumbling backward, his face shifting from confident cruelty to shocked surprise in the space of a heartbeat. The technique was one of the first Papa had taught her, designed to incapacitate without causing permanent injury, to end a threat quickly and decisively. "What the hell?" Trevor gasped, his voice reduced to a wheeze as he struggled to catch his breath. Madison's perfectly composed facade cracked for the first time since Kira had known her. "Trevor, get up! She just got lucky!" But Trevor was already moving forward again, his embarrassment fueling his anger in a way that made him dangerous and unpredictable. He swung widely, telegraphing the punch in a way that would have made Papa shake his head in disappointment at such poor technique. Kira ducked under his arm with fluid grace and swept his legs, sending him crashing to the concrete with a satisfying thud that echoed across the courtyard. Blake had stopped recording, his phone forgotten in his hand as he stared at the scene unfolding before him with something approaching awe. "Holy shit," he breathed, the words escaping before he could stop them. The sound of Trevor hitting the ground seemed to break whatever spell had held the small audience of witnesses who had begun to gather at the edges of the courtyard. Students emerged from behind trees and around corners, drawn by the commotion like moths to a flame. Some had their phones out, already recording what promised to be the most talked-about incident of the semester. Trevor struggled to his feet, his face red with embarrassment and rage. His Letterman jacket was scuffed from his impact with the concrete, and there was a scrape on his palm where he had tried to break his fall. The physical damage was minimal, but the psychological impact was devastating. His reputation as someone who could intimidate others with impunity had been shattered in front of witnesses, and everyone present understood that the social dynamics of Jefferson High School had shifted permanently. "You think you're tough?" Trevor snarled, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that hadn't been there before. "You think you can just—" He charged forward again, and this time Kira didn't hesitate. Papa had taught her that once a fight began, you finished it quickly and decisively. Prolonged conflict increased the risk of injury to everyone involved and gave your opponent opportunities to recover and adapt. She sidestepped his clumsy rush, grabbed his arm, and used his own momentum to send him sprawling across the courtyard. "Stay down," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly what they were capable of. The words came out in the tone Papa had taught her to use in combat situations, calm, controlled, and absolutely certain. But Trevor was beyond reason now. His pride had been wounded in front of an audience that included some of the most socially connected students in the school. By tomorrow, everyone would know that Trevor Holloway, star linebacker and social king of Jefferson High School, had been systematically dismantled by the quiet girl from Louisiana that everyone had dismissed as harmless. He came at her again, this time with Blake joining him, apparently deciding that 2 against 1 were better odds than continuing to watch his friend suffer alone. Blake's intervention transformed the situation from a defensive action into something more complex, a multiple attacker scenario that Papa had prepared her for, but that she had never faced in real life. What followed was a display of controlled violence that left everyone watching in stunned silence. Kira moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years perfecting her craft, her body shifting and flowing around their attacks like water around stones. Every strike was precise, every movement calculated for maximum effect with minimum effort. Papa's training had emphasized efficiency above all else. "You're smaller than most people who might want to hurt you, Cher," he had explained during one of their sessions. That means you can't afford to waste energy or make mistakes. Every movement has to count. Every technique has to serve a purpose. Blake went down first, a perfectly executed throw that sent him tumbling across the grass with enough force to drive the air from his lungs, but not enough to cause serious injury. He stayed down, clutching his shoulder and staring at Kira with something approaching reverence. The wannabe influencer had never been in a real fight, and the reality of physical confrontation was far different from the violent movies and video games that had shaped his expectations. Trevor lasted longer, his size and strength making him a more challenging opponent. But size meant nothing when facing someone who understood leverage, timing, and anatomy. Papa had spent years teaching Kira how to use an opponent's advantages against them, how to turn their strength into a liability and their aggression into an opportunity. She caught Trevor's next punch with both hands, twisted his arm behind his back with surgical precision, and drove him face first into the concrete with just enough force to demonstrate her control over the situation. For a moment, she held him there, his arm hyperextended just to the point of pain, but not injury. This was the moment Papa had always warned her about, the moment when the power to hurt someone completely was in her hands. She could feel the tremor in Trevor's arm, knew that one more twist would break it cleanly, would give her the kind of definitive victory that would ensure he never bothered her again. The temptation was stronger than she had expected, fueled by weeks of accumulated humiliation and the adrenaline of combat. But Papa's voice was stronger than her anger, his moral teachings more powerful than her desire for revenge. The moment you become the thing you hate, Cher, you've lost more than any fight could ever cost you. Your soul, that's worth more than your pride or your anger. You remember that. She released Trevor's arm and stepped back, her breathing steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. The sudden absence of pressure left him gasping against the concrete, his face a mask of pain and humiliation that would probably haunt his dreams for months to come. Trevor rolled over slowly, his movements careful and deliberate as he tested for injury. When he looked up at her, Kira saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Genuine fear, mixed with something that might have been respect. "I don't want to fight you," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard. "I never wanted to fight any of you. I just wanted to be left alone, to eat my lunch and read my book and get through high school without being tormented for entertainment." Madison, who had been frozen in shock during the entire confrontation, finally found her voice. "You're crazy!" she shrieked, her perfect composure finally cracking completely. "You're absolutely crazy. We were just talking to you, and you attacked us." "No," Kira said, turning to face the girl who had tormented her for weeks with calculated cruelty. "I'm tired. I'm tired of being treated like I'm not human. I'm tired of being laughed at and pushed around and made to feel like I don't belong anywhere. I'm tired of having my family's struggles used as entertainment, and I'm tired of watching the one person who showed me kindness being threatened because he dared to treat me like a human being." She looked around at the faces staring at her, some shocked, some impressed, some frightened by the display of controlled violence they had just witnessed. The crowd had grown during the confrontation, and she recognized faces from various social groups throughout the school. By the end of the day, everyone at Jefferson High School would know what had happened in the courtyard behind the gymnasium. "I never asked for any of this," she continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "I didn't ask to move here. I didn't ask to leave everything I knew and loved behind. I didn't ask to be the outsider, the target, the entertainment for people who have everything handed to them and still need to hurt others to feel good about themselves." Danny stepped forward, his camera forgotten, his expression mixing admiration with concern. He had remained safely out of the way during the actual fighting, understanding instinctively that Kira neither needed nor wanted his help in handling the physical confrontation. But now, As the immediate danger passed, he moved to stand beside her in a gesture of solidarity that wasn't lost on anyone watching. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying the same genuine concern that had first drawn her to him. The simple question, asked with such obvious care, almost broke her composure entirely. After weeks of being treated as less than human, basic kindness felt like a foreign language that she was still learning to understand. "I'm okay," she said, though her voice trembled slightly with the aftershock of adrenaline and emotion. Trevor struggled to his feet with movements that were careful and deliberate, testing for injury while trying to maintain some semblance of dignity in front of the assembled crowd. His Letterman jacket was torn at the shoulder and there was blood on his face from where it had connected with the concrete, but the damage was mostly cosmetic. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity beneath the pain and humiliation. "My grandfather," Kira said simply. "He taught me that fighting should be a last resort. But when someone threatens the people you care about, sometimes it's the only option that matters." The crowd that had gathered began to disperse slowly, as the sound of approaching footsteps indicated that faculty were finally arriving to investigate the commotion. But the damage was done, and everyone who had witnessed the confrontation knew that the social dynamics of Jefferson High School had shifted permanently and irrevocably. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly librarian, was the first adult to arrive, her romance novel still clutched in her hand as she surveyed the scene with the expression of someone who had just discovered that her quiet afternoon had been disrupted by teenage drama. She was followed quickly by Coach Martinez, the assistant football coach, whose primary concern seemed to be assessing Trevor's condition rather than understanding what had led to the confrontation. "What happened here?" Mrs. Henderson asked, her voice carrying the weary authority of someone who had dealt with too many teenage crises over the course of her career. The question hung in the air as everyone present seemed to realize simultaneously that their answer would determine how the incident was officially recorded and how the consequences would be distributed. Kira felt the familiar anxiety returning as she prepared to explain herself to adults who would probably view her as the aggressor, regardless of the circumstances that had led to the fight. But before she could speak, Danny stepped forward with quiet confidence. Trevor and his friends were harassing Kira during lunch. They were making racist comments about her background and threatening to break my camera. When Trevor tried to grab it, Kira defended us. His account was simple, accurate, and delivered with the kind of calm authority that adults tended to respect from student newspaper photographers. Several other students nodded in agreement, including some who had been recording the entire encounter on their phones. Blake, still sitting on the ground and nursing his shoulder, looked like he wanted to contradict Danny's version of events, but the presence of multiple witnesses and recorded evidence made denial futile. Madison opened her mouth as if to speak, then seemed to think better of it, perhaps realizing that her usual tactics of manipulation and social pressure wouldn't be effective in this particular situation. Trevor said nothing at all, his silence speaking volumes about his understanding of how the incident would be perceived by anyone who reviewed the evidence objectively. The administrative response that followed was swift and predictable. Principal Morrison, a man who prided himself on maintaining order through zero-tolerance policies, arrived within minutes to take statements and begin the process of determining consequences. Trevor, Blake, and Madison were escorted to the main office for questioning, while Kira and Danny were asked to wait in the nurse's office until their parents could be contacted. The next few hours passed in a blur of phone calls, meetings, and official statements. Kira's parents arrived at the school with expressions that mixed concern for their daughter with embarrassment about being called away from work. Jean-Baptiste still carried the defeated posture of a man whose identity had been shattered by unemployment, while Celeste radiated the fierce protectiveness of a mother whose child had been threatened. The security footage from various cameras around the school told a story that supported Danny's account of events. Trevor, Madison, and Blake had clearly initiated the confrontation, and Kira's response could reasonably be characterized as self-defense. The videos that students had recorded with their phones provided additional evidence that the harassment had been ongoing and systematic. In the end, Trevor received a 3-day suspension for harassment and initiating a physical altercation. Blake and Madison were given detention and required to attend sensitivity training sessions about bullying and discrimination. Kira received no official punishment, though Principal Morrison made it clear that any future incidents would be viewed less favorably regardless of the circumstances. But the real consequences played out in the social realm rather than the administrative one. By the end of the school day, the videos of the fight had spread through social media faster than wildfire, shared and reshared across platforms with commentary that painted Kira as everything from a dangerous psychopath to a folk hero standing up to bullies. The narrative that emerged wasn't entirely accurate, but it was compelling. The quiet outsider who had finally had enough, who had stood up to the popular kids who thought they could torment anyone without consequences. The story resonated with students who had their own experiences with bullying, and within days, Kira found herself occupying a completely different position in the social hierarchy of Jefferson High School. The transformation was both gradual and dramatic. Students who had never acknowledged her existence before began nodding politely when they passed her in the hallways. Some even smiled, offering the kind of casual recognition that had been entirely absent during her first 3 months at the school. The whispers that followed her through the corridors now carried undertones of respect rather than mockery. She overheard fragments of conversations that referred to her as badass and someone you don't want to mess with, descriptions that were both accurate and entirely missing the point of what had actually happened. Trevor, Madison, and Blake kept their distance with the wary respect of predators who had discovered that their intended prey was actually an apex predator in disguise. The videos of the fight had made it clear that Kira possessed skills that none of them could match, and their previous confidence in their ability to intimidate her had been replaced by a healthy fear of further humiliation. More importantly, her friendship with Danny had deepened into something more meaningful than either of them had expected. They began spending their lunch periods together regularly, finding refuge in conversations about photography and literature, and the small dreams that made high school bearable. He had been there in the courtyard when she needed someone to defend, and she had been there when he needed protection. The bond forged in that moment of mutual vulnerability had created a foundation for something that might eventually become love. "Do you ever regret it?" Danny asked one afternoon as they sat in the same courtyard where everything had changed, sharing a lunch that Celeste had packed with enough food for both of them. "Fighting back, I mean?" Kira considered the question carefully, weighing her words with the same precision that Papa had taught her to use in planning combat techniques. "I regret that it came to that. I regret that talking and reasoning and trying to be invisible didn't work. But I don't regret standing up for myself, and I definitely don't regret protecting you." "Your grandfather would be proud," Danny said, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who had come to understand the moral framework that guided her actions. "I think he would," she agreed, feeling the warmth of Papa's memory like sunlight filtering through the pine trees overhead. He always said that strength isn't about being able to hurt people, it's about knowing when not to and having the courage to act when it matters. The weeks that followed brought unexpected developments that neither Kira nor Danny could have anticipated. Mrs. Peterson, the AP English teacher, approached Kira about submitting some of her writing to regional competitions, suggesting that her unique perspective and powerful voice deserved a wider audience. The school newspaper, under Danny's influence, began covering issues of bullying and social exclusion with a depth and sensitivity that hadn't been present in previous years. More surprisingly, other students began seeking out Kira's friendship, drawn by her reputation for quiet strength and her unwillingness to tolerate cruelty. She found herself at the center of a small but growing group of students who had previously felt isolated and vulnerable. Kids who had been targets themselves and who recognized in her someone who understood their experiences. The group wasn't large, maybe 8 or 10 students who began eating lunch together and supporting each other through the daily challenges of high school life. But it was genuine in a way that most social groups at Jefferson High School were not. They were united not by shared interests or social status, but by their common understanding of what it felt like to be outsiders and their collective determination to create something better. 3 months after the confrontation in the courtyard, Trevor approached Kira's table in the cafeteria with hesitant steps and an expression that was difficult to read. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as he stood there, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his usual confident posture replaced by something that looked almost like humility. "Can I sit?" he asked, his voice lacking the authoritative tone that had once characterized every interaction Kira had witnessed between him and other students. Kira nodded, curious about what he might have to say and willing to give him the opportunity to surprise her. Danny and the others at their table watched with obvious tension, ready to intervene if the conversation took a negative turn. "I've been thinking about what happened," Trevor said slowly, his words careful and deliberate, as if he had rehearsed them but wasn't entirely confident in their delivery. "About what I did, what we did to you. And I wanted to say I'm sorry." The apology hung in the air between them, simple words that carried the weight of months of accumulated cruelty and the possibility of redemption. Kira could feel the attention of everyone in the cafeteria focused on their table, students straining to hear a conversation that would undoubtedly be dissected and analyzed for days to come. "I don't know why I thought it was okay to treat you like that," Trevor continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "I guess I thought... I don't know what I thought. Maybe that it didn't matter because you were different, because you weren't part of our group. But you were right to stand up for yourself. You were right to fight back." "Fighting back was never the point," Kira said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the unusual silence of the cafeteria. "The point was that I shouldn't have needed to. The point was that none of it should have happened in the first place." Trevor nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful in a way that suggested he was genuinely processing her words rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. Yeah, I get that now. I've been thinking about what my little sister would do if someone treated her the way I treated you, and it made me realize how screwed up the whole thing was." The mention of his little sister was humanizing in a way that Kira hadn't expected. Throughout their previous encounters, Trevor had seemed like a force of nature rather than a person with family connections and emotional vulnerabilities. The idea that he had people he cared about, people he would want to protect from the kind of treatment he had inflicted on others, created a bridge of understanding that hadn't existed before. "I talked to a counselor," Trevor continued, apparently deciding that honesty was the best approach to what was clearly a difficult conversation. "My parents made me after the suspension, and she helped me understand some things about why I was doing what I was doing. It doesn't excuse it, but at least I understand it better now." He stood up to leave, then paused as if gathering courage for one final statement. "For what it's worth, I'm glad you didn't break my arm that day. You could have, couldn't you?" "Yes," Kira said simply, her honesty cutting through any pretense or false modesty. "But you didn't. That says something about who you are, about the kind of person you choose to be, even when you have every reason to be cruel. I hope I can learn to be more like that. As Trevor walked away, Kira felt a sense of completion that had been missing since the confrontation in the courtyard. The apology didn't erase the months of torment he had inflicted, but it represented something important. The possibility that people could change, that cruelty wasn't necessarily permanent, that even the worst bullies might eventually develop empathy and understanding. The final bell rang, signaling the end of another day at Jefferson High School. As Kira walked through the hallways toward her locker, she reflected on how much had changed since those first terrifying weeks when every day felt like a battle for basic dignity and respect. She still wore thrift store clothes and spoke with a Creole accent that marked her as different from most of her classmates. Her family's economic situation hadn't improved significantly, and she was still fundamentally an outsider in a community that valued conformity and social connection above individual achievement. But those things no longer marked her as a target for cruelty. Instead, they were simply part of who she was, and that was enough. Danny was waiting by her locker, his camera bag slung over his shoulder and a genuine smile on his face that never failed to make her heart skip a beat. Their relationship had evolved slowly and naturally from friendship into something deeper, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared experiences that had tested and strengthened their bond. "Ready to go?" he asked, the same question he posed every day, but one that never lost its warmth or significance. "Ready," she said, shouldering her backpack and feeling the familiar satisfaction of another day survived and conquered. As they walked toward the exit together, Kira thought about the lesson her grandfather had tried to teach her all those years ago in the converted barn behind his house. Violence was never the first choice, but sometimes it was the only choice that mattered. More importantly, the real strength lay in knowing the difference, in having the courage to act when necessary, and in never losing sight of who you were in the process. The setting sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as they walked toward the bus stop, two students who had found each other in the chaos of high school hierarchy and discovered that friendship could flourish even in the most unlikely circumstances. Behind them, Jefferson High School stood silent and imposing against the Georgia sky, but it no longer felt like a prison or a battlefield. It was just a building filled with people learning how to be human, making mistakes, sometimes learning from them, and occasionally discovering that kindness and courage could triumph over cruelty and fear. For Kira Delacroix, that was lesson enough for one lifetime, though she suspected that Papa would have been proud of how she had learned to apply his teachings in circumstances he could never have imagined. The future stretched ahead of them, full of possibility and promise. And for the first time since leaving Louisiana, Kira felt like she was exactly where she belonged.